Shalom. This is Yair Davidiy speaking to you from the land of Israel. Today we're about to discuss the prophecy of Hosea. First couple of chapters of Hosea. We're basing ourselves on a new book that we have just published, Hebrew Bride. This is a very important book. It's worth acquiring. But all of it, this talk should be of interest. It is important. It deals with an important subject. It deals with the lost 10 tribes. As you undoubtedly know, our organisation, Brit-Am, Hebrew Nations, Brit-Am, we research the whereabouts of the lost 10 tribes. We believe in it. We have researched it. We use biblical sources. We use historical sources, rabbinical sources, mythological sources, linguistics, anthropology, every field that somehow either has something to do with the subject. We study it, we learn about it, and we propagate our findings. And we work towards reconciliation between the Jewish people and the lost 10 tribes of Israel. And where do we find the lost 10 tribes of Israel? We find the lost 10 tribes amongst Western peoples, or they may be all over the place, they may be in many nations, but nevertheless, according to the Bible, they are to be searched for primarily, they are to be found primarily in certain nations. We do not say that everyone in those nations belongs to the lost 10 tribes. We say that that is where the lost 10 tribes are, that is where they are to be found. And what exact proportion they are is not known to us. We believe it is significant. That is an open question. The most important point at present is to affirm the reality that in those nations are to be found the lost 10 tribes of Israel. And the peoples we are talking about, amongst whom the lost 10 tribes are to be found, they include Sweden, they include Finland, Norway, Denmark, the Netherlands, Belgium, they include France, Switzerland, Britain, that includes Scotland, England, Ireland, Wales, and Northern Ireland. All those areas belong to lost 10 tribes. That's where lost 10 tribes are to be found, and their offshoots overseas in Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, Canada, and the USA, and other areas. And this is what we find. The Bible tells us about this, and it is affirmed by historians. So this book, this new book of ours, Hebrew Bride, deals with certain aspects of the proofs and, as we say, tightens up certain areas of inquiry and sharpens up the whole point. This book is based on the prophecy of Hosea. Hosea, as you know, he took the metaphor of a loose woman called Gomer, with whom he was commanded by God Almighty to conjugate with, to live in union with as man and wife, and to have children from. And his relationships with this woman and the children he had from her and so on, they form the basis of the book. And there are some authorities that suggest that the whole thing was a metaphor, that actually Prophet Hosea did not do this thing. He did not live in this way, whereas others say he did. That even though it was not the type of behaviour or the type of a relationship one would expect from a prophet, it was an exception in order to give body, substance, one could say, to the metaphor, to the parable that he was playing out in his lifestyle, in his whole life, and the names that he gave to his children that reflect the destiny and the situation of the lost 10 tribes in their places of exile and in their future redemption. Now, who was Hosea? The prophet Hosea was a prince. He was a prince from the tribe of Reuben. His father was a leader of the tribe of Reuben when they went into exile, and he himself lived at the time when the 10 tribes were being exiled. There were 12 tribes of Israel. They divided into two different sections. We had the section of Judah, the people who became the Jewish people in the south, and you had the people who became the lost 10 tribes in the north. They divided into two separate kingdoms. And the northern kingdom was conquered by the Assyrians, taken into exile, and all its inhabitants were lost. They disappeared from history. Their consciousness was lost to themselves, and awareness of who they were has been lost to the world. But nevertheless, they existed. Physically, they existed, and they moved. God knew who they were. The Bible knows who they are. The Bible speaks about them, and we find hints in general history and historical records showing they did migrate to Western regions. The name of Hosea is a form of the name of Yahushua. Yahushua was the disciple, was the student, the understudy of Moses. He was also known as Yahushua. Hosea was renamed Yahushua. He was the understudy of Moses. He replaced Moses when Moses died. He led the Israelites in conquering the land of Israel, the land of Canaan, and he was from the tribe of Ephraim. And he was, as if to say, the first conqueror of Israel. The last king of the northern kingdom before it was taken into exile had the same name, Hosea. And it is significance in the fact that the first conqueror on behalf of the Israelites in conquering the land had the same name as the last king of the northern tribes, who was incidentally also from the tribe of Ephraim, in losing the land. And not only that, but in his lifetime there was a prophet named Hosea, who also prophesied concerning the lost 10 tribes and played out the simile of the lost 10 tribes going into exile through the relationship with his wife, with the woman he took, who's known as Gomer. Gomer was the name of this woman who represents the lost 10 tribes, or whose children represent the figures of the lost 10 tribes, of different aspects of the lost 10 tribes in their places of exile. Gomer is also the name of the sons of Japheth. We had Noah. Noah was the first representative of humanity after the deluge. All of mankind was wiped out in the flood. Then Noah was the only one who remained, he and his sons. The sons of Noah were Shem, Ham, and Japheth. One of the sons of Japheth was known as Gomer. Gomer had 3 sons, Ashkenaz, Riphat, and Togarmah. And these sons are placed, according to the sages, in areas of the north, on the Caucasus area, Iran, and all that region. And we find here peoples who are considered the descendants of Gomer. And in these same areas, according to these same sources, the lost 10 tribes were taken away by the Assyrians and resettled there. And they intermixed with the peoples there. And they were given names of the peoples living in those regions, or the people in those regions took their names. They intermixed or intermerged or confederated with peoples in those areas. And the Sumerians referred to them as Gimri, or other names reflecting Gomer. It's all spoken about in the book of Hosea. And Hosea refers expressly to the 10 tribes of Israel. He does not refer to Judah. Judah is expressly excluded from the equation. Judah is mentioned here and there only to exclude him from the equation being made concerning the lost 10 tribes. For instance, in Hosea 1 verse 7 he says, but he describes the lost 10 tribes in places of exile, and then he says, but I will have compassion on the house of Judah and deliver them by the Lord their God, and will not deliver them by bow, sword, battle, and horses or horsemen. In other words, they will have a different task in the world to play and a different fate. Also we find in Hosea 11 verse 12, Ephraim compassed me about with lies, and the house of Israel with deceit. Yet Judah ruleth with God and is faithful with the saints with him. Judah remained faithful. Judah is not the personage being spoken about in the prophecies of Hosea. One of the names that Hosea gives to the children of Gomer, his children by Gomer, is Yisrael. He gives an explanation for the name Israel in Hebrew, and the name Israel in Hebrew has different connotations. One of them means scattered seed, and this very same name, scattered seed, is a name that the Assyrians applied to a section of the Cimmerians, to one of the Cimmerian peoples, whom other proofs tend to indicate that these people were the lost 10 tribes of Israel, or a portion of them. So here we have a connection with the names, a double connection, not only with Gomer, but a double connection through this name Israel with a Z. Israel with a Z. Also a Welsh legend refers to their ancestry from the Cimmerians. It was a famous Rabbi Yisrael Alta, whom I met incidentally, and he too identified the Israelites with the Gomeri, that is with the Cimmerians. But he did that from a religious point of view. But his opinion dovetails, interlaps, overlaps, and interweaves with our own explanation. At all events, the lost 10 tribes will return. Not sure how this will come about, but we may have a task in this, we may not. At all events, one of the stages in the return of lost 10 tribes is identifying who they are and spreading knowledge of this vital information however we can. As we said, Hosea excluded Judah from the equation of what will happen to lost 10 tribes. The fate of Judah will be different from theirs. And it says in Hosea 1:7, verse 7, I will compassion on the house of Judah and deliver them by the Lord their God, and will not deliver them by bow or sword, battle horses or horsemen. So the Jews in their places of exile were not to be known as warriors until they return. They were not to return by way of force, whereas the lost tribes were to assert themselves by way of force and by way of their military power. And this is reflected or as receives substantiation, one could say, from Jewish religious tradition, according to which when Israel, that is the Jewish people, went into exile, 3 oaths were made, 3 oaths were exerted. The Jews were made to promise that they would not rebel against the Gentiles, that they would not return to the land of Israel by force, and for their part the Gentiles undertook not to oppress the Jews excessively. And according to most understandings, these verses were contingent upon each other. That is, if the Gentiles did oppress the Jews excessively, then the other 2 portions of the oaths would not apply. Also, these oaths are not legally binding. They were more or less a metaphysical description of reality rather than something that really existed. But nevertheless, this did reflect a feeling, an understanding that did exist. Not all great sages believed in it. For instance, we have Nahmanides, whom we referred to on several times, and he said that in each generation, the Jewish people or all Israelites who live by the law have an obligation to conquer the land of Canaan. He says we are commanded to take possession of the land which the Almighty, blessed be He, gave to our forefathers, to Abraham, to Isaac, to Yaakov, and not to abandon it to other nations, not to let other nations take it over, or to leave it desolate, not to leave them to leave the land empty, as was done before the Jews came here. But he said, you shall dispossess the inhabitants of the land and dwell in it, for I have given the land to you to possess it. This was a commandment, and this is how Nahmanides explained the commandment to be obligatory in each generation. At all events, according to the law, to the oaths, people take the oaths, the swearing, one could say, the promises that were made, another name for oath, into consideration. They were contingent on the Gentiles not oppressing the Jews excessively, but this is what did happen. We had the Holocaust, and before the Holocaust, we had pogroms and persecutions, and the Gentiles had exceeded what could be rationally expected of them. And therefore the Jews were freed, not being allowed to go up to the land and to take it back by force. But in addition to that, we had the Balfour Declaration. The Balfour Declaration was issued by Britain in 1917. It was issued towards the end of the First World War, when the British had just entered the land of Palestine to conquer it from the Turks. And they were about to conquer the Turkish Empire. Russia had withdrawn from the war. Russia was in the throes of a revolution. The German and the Austro-Hungarian empires were on the verge of collapse, on the verge of defeat, and the world was about to be reorganized. Britain at that time was the most powerful country in the earth. It ruled directly over 1/5 of the world, and over a much larger percentage indirectly. It was coordinating its actions with France and the USA, who were also major empires or major powers at that time. So in effect, it did reflect the major voices amongst the world's nations. And the Balfour Declaration, which recognized the right of the Jews to return and to build a national home in the land of Palestine. This was affirmed later in 1920 by the League of Nations, which represent all the nations of the earth. And so one could say that the Jews were freed of their obligations not to go up to the land and take it back by force as a group, because the Gentiles had given them permission to do so. One should also point out that legally the position of the Jews at the time was similar to that of a slave, as existed in former times. And a slave, when he's a slave, he is subjected to the will of his master. But once his master frees him, once his master grants him manumission, makes him a free man, he becomes the equal of his master. And his master can no longer have a claim upon him. And even if his master had freedom only on certain conditions, it doesn't matter. Once he is freed, he is freed. So too with the Jews. Once the Jews were allowed to return to the land and build up the land, it became theirs. The Gentiles no longer had a legal right to interfere in that, and have forgotten that and have not realised it. And they keep on interfering in the land of Israel and keep on forcing the Jews to kowtow and to take cognizance of the Palestinians and to consider their feelings and to allow them to do all kinds of bad actions and negative attitudes and terror attacks against the Jewish people that would not be allowed, that would not be suffered, that would not be tolerated by other peoples. Nevertheless, this is the reality, and the Jews have been rebuilding the land and have been rebuilding the land and have been rebuilding the land due to the British having helped them in the beginning and now through the USA helping them. And in tradition, these forces represent the forces of Joseph, the tribes of Joseph, and in the future the tribes of Joseph will play an important role in bringing on the future redemption. We will close up now with two main points. Two main points worth noting. According to tradition, the lost Gentiles will return when the Jews, that is the tribes of Judah and Benjamin, will go unto them and call upon them to come back. In other words, make known to them who they are, reveal this knowledge to them, and they shall return. That is on one side. On the other side, the future redemption will come about primarily, at least at the beginning, through the action of Joseph. We identify Joseph, that is Ephraim and Manasseh, with the English-speaking peoples. And we have come across a midrash which reflects this truth. Midrash Tanhuma, Pashat Nasa 30, it says, "The Almighty said to Joseph, even though I paid you part of your reward, the capital is preserved for you. The main part is preserved for you." This is in order that Israel should be redeemed with an everlasting redemption. By virtue of Jacob, that is Israel, Jacob is another name for Israel, and by virtue of you, Joseph, they shall be redeemed, as it says in Psalms 17, verse 15. In Psalm 17, verse 15, it says, "You, that is God, have by your power redeemed your people, the sons of Jacob and Joseph." That is, the future redemption will come about through Judah, revealing to those Gentiles who they are, and then through Joseph playing his part in this future redemption. May the Lord God of Israel bless you. Thank you.